before the word anesthesia was even whispered in science, men with saws and steady hands ruled over operating tables. Surgery was agony, survival was luck, and screaming was a guarantee. Tonight, we step into the candlelit horror of a time when cutting into flesh was done wide awake, and often wide-eyed. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. And ask yourself, would you survive a surgery without anesthesia? The year is 2095. You've been stabbed in the thigh. Infection is setting in fast. You're brought to a small wooden hut that smells of old blood and rotting herbs. A man in a dirty apron greets you with a nod. He's not a doctor, just a man with a bone saw. And what he says next chills your soul. You'll need to stay awake for this. Anesthesia won't be discovered for another 50 years. No ether, no chloroform, no numbing agents. In this era, surgery meant conscious pain. Raw and violent. You'd be held down by 4 men while the surgeon cut. Screams were expected. Some patients passed out from pain. Others didn't, and remembered everything. The tools weren't sterile. No gloves, no washing hands. Instruments were reused again and again, blood still crusted in the joints. There were saws, rusty hooks, hot irons for cauterizing. The concept of germs was centuries away. If the wound didn't kill you, the fever usually did. Surgeons weren't seen as wise men. They were considered tradesmen like butchers or blacksmiths. Many didn't study books, only bodies. Some practiced on corpses stolen from graves. Others learned on live patients, with no guidance beyond instinct and desperation. The patient was both lesson and sacrifice. Sometimes, patients would sing hymns or bite leather straps. Wine might help dull the pain, but rarely enough. Richer patients chewed opium or henbane. Poorer ones clenched their jaws and prayed. The shock of the cut, the skin, then muscle, then bone, could stop a heart cold. And it often did. Speed was survival. Surgeons prided themselves on how quickly they could amputate a limb. One famous surgeon in London could remove a leg in under 30 seconds. But speed had a cost. Many lost too much blood. Some bled out on the floor. Others lived, but only as half people, haunted by pain and memory. There were no antibiotics. After surgery, wounds festered, pus rot, fever. The smell alone told you if the patient would live. Surgeons would poke at wounds with bare fingers, not knowing they were spreading death. Some sealed wounds with boiling oil. Others left them open to the air and to flies. Surgeons were feared. They walked into towns with bags of blades and jars of leeches. They were seen as a last resort, a gamble between survival and certain death. Some were revered as miracle workers. Others were chased from villages after too many corpses piled up. In battlefield surgery, the horror multiplied. Limbs were removed by the dozen, screams echoing across tents. Surgeons worked in shifts, blades never dry. No time for cleaning. Just cut. Cauterize, move on. Some soldiers were held down by comrades. Others begged for death rather than treatment. It wasn't until the 1800s that true anesthesia was discovered. Chloroform. Either. At last, surgery could be silent, controlled, human. But by then, thousands had already died on bloody tables, conscious to the end. And surgeons? Well, they learned through the screams. Surgeons were sometimes called sawbones. Not out of disrespect, out of brutal honesty. Their reputation was built on one thing: the ability to cut fast, deep, and without hesitation. In a world without anesthesia, Hesitation meant pain, and pain meant panic. Panic made people bleed faster, dying quicker. Surgical manuals of the time were chilling. Some read more like butcher instructions than medical texts. "Hold the limb firmly," one said, "then proceed without mercy." Mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Speed was everything. Precision. That came later, if you were lucky enough to survive. Wounds were sealed with whatever was available. Heated irons, tar, wine. If it stopped the bleeding, it was used. Infection came later, and often. No one understood sepsis, or the invisible armies of bacteria waging war under the skin. People just knew the fever came, and then the cold. Post-surgery, you weren't taken to recovery. You were laid on a wooden board, or straw. You'd be wrapped in cloth and left in silence, if not in prayer. The pain didn't end when the blade stopped. It pulsed on, like a drumbeat. Many died days later. Others wished they had. Some of the worst procedures involved the skull. Trepanation, drilling a hole in the head, was performed to release spirits or reduce swelling. No numbing. Just sharp stone, then metal. Patients had to stay still while their skulls cracked. Some survived. Most did not. There were no operating rooms. Surgeries happened wherever space allowed. Kitchens, workshops, barns. Crowds gathered. Blood ran across floorboards. Children watched their fathers scream. The smell of iron and rot lingered. No curtains. No privacy. Just raw human pain. Not all surgeons were cruel. Some were desperate. They wanted to help but had no tools, no knowledge, no understanding of disease. They cut because they didn't know what else to do. In that ignorance, they did more harm than good. And still, people kept coming to them, because there was no one else. The church had strict rules. Dissecting human bodies was often banned, limiting knowledge. Those who did explore anatomy had to do it in secret. Some surgeons bribed gravekeepers. Others used the corpses of criminals. But studying the dead was dangerous, socially and legally. There was also no standard training. One surgeon might have years of battlefield experience. Another might have only read a book. And another, your neighbor, perhaps just picked it up as a side job. There were no certifications. No boards, only scars left behind. Mistakes were deadly. Cutting the wrong artery, misjudging the depth, stitching too tight, or not at all. A single slip of the hand could turn hope into horror. And the worst part, you'd be awake for every second, watching, listening, feeling, until the darkness came. If you screamed, no one flinched. Screaming was normal, expected. It meant you were still alive. Silence. That was the true fear. When a patient stopped yelling mid-surgery, everyone paused. Because silence meant death, or shock, or that the pain had simply stolen their voice. Children weren't spared either. A broken bone, a rotten tooth, a sickness that required cutting. Surgeons approached them just as they did adults, with rough hands and dull knives. Mothers cried, fathers held them down, and the children remembered, if they survived. Teeth were another battlefield. Rotten molars were ripped out with iron pliers, no numbing, gums torn, blood pouring. Some people died of infected gums. Others had their jaws broken in the process. Barbers were the usual dentists, and most of them had shaking hands. Bloodletting was common. Got a fever, cut a vein, feeling dizzy, drain a pent. Surgeons believed sickness came from imbalances in the body's fluids, so they sliced arms, legs, even necks, to let the bad blood out. Many patients left weaker. Some didn't leave at all. Cauterizing was both cure and curse. Heated irons seared the flesh shut. It stopped bleeding, but it burned deep, cooking nerves and tissue alike. The pain was unholy. Some surgeons did it mid-surgery, others after. The sound of sizzling human skin was one no one forgot. Bandages weren't sterile. They were reused strips of cloth, sometimes washed, sometimes not. Blood from the last patient might still stain the threads. Herbs were applied directly to open wounds, sometimes helping, often harming. Rot set in quickly. Amputation often followed. There were no anesthesiologists, no nurses, sometimes not even an assistant. Just the surgeon and the screams. Family members helped hold patients down, or strangers. Anyone strong enough, and they had to be, because pain makes people thrash, and movement meant mistakes. The first real surgical breakthrough came not with a tool, but with an idea. What if pain could be silenced? But it would take centuries for that idea to bloom. Until then, surgeries remained scenes of agony. Even the bravest souls trembled at the thought of the knife. Women rarely became surgeons, but they were often midwives, delivering babies with bare hands and no aid. When something went wrong, they had only their instinct and prayer. Surgery during childbirth was a death sentence. For mother, for child, for both. Pain was part of life, but in surgery it became something deeper, ritualized suffering. There were no patient rights, no consent forms, just trust and terror. You walked into the surgeon's hut, knowing you might not walk out, and if you did, you'd never walk the same. In 1307, a real case shook Paris. A man named Geoffroy, a baker, had a tumor in his thigh. It grew until he couldn't walk. A barber, surgeon named Tyne attempted to cut it out. In a smoky room, with a dull blade and boiling water. The procedure took nearly an hour. Geoffroy screamed until he passed out. He died 2 days later, but Tyne was praised for trying. That was considered success. Surgeons back then weren't wearing white coats. They wore leather aprons, stained, cracked, and sometimes still wet with blood. Some even took pride in it. Shows experience, they'd say. The more soaked the apron, the more skilled you supposedly were. Today, that would get you shut down by any health department in 10 seconds. Let's take a quick breath. Because yes, this is heavy stuff. But don't worry, not every medieval medical act was barbaric. Some traditions did help pave the way for modern medicine, even if they were clumsy, cruel, or desperate. The road to safer surgery was long and painful. Early surgeons began experimenting with herbal concoctions, not for numbing, but for cleaning wounds. Some used wine as an antiseptic, not knowing that the alcohol actually helped kill bacteria. Others applied poultices made from crushed plants and honey, hoping to stave off infection. Yet, without understanding germs, these remedies were a gamble. Many patients survived by sheer luck, or because their bodies were strong enough to fight off the unseen enemies. Meanwhile, surgeons continued to sharpen their blades and their skills, learning from every failed attempt and every horrifying scream. By the late 1400s, a few surgeons began advocating for cleanliness, washing their hands before operating, rinsing tools in wine or vinegar. It was a controversial idea. Many ridiculed it as superstition or nonsense. But slowly, the concept of hygiene started to take root in some surgical circles. Still, these small improvements were overshadowed by the lack of anesthesia. Patients had to be restrained, often tied down or held by dozens of strong men. Even a moment's movement could be deadly. Surgeons needed to be brutal and fast, their hands steady despite the chaos and the screams. Let's meet Brunhild, a midwife surgeon from Saxony. She wasn't officially trained, but her hands saved dozens during childbirth complications. One remarkable story tells how she amputated a man's leg to stop gangrene, using nothing but a saw and strong wine. Legend has it the man lived to dance again, though not very gracefully. Surgery back then was a brutal necessity. but it saved lives in the most desperate situations. Surgery was often performed outdoors, surprisingly. The reason was simple: better natural light and a cleaner environment than most medieval rooms, which were cramped, dark, and filthy. Ironically, this operating theatre came with spectators. Flies, dogs, and curious children often gathered around, watching in grim fascination. What we might consider a gruesome ordeal today was, for them, a kind of public event. Battlefield surgeons were both heroes and butchers. They worked under terrifying pressure, with little time to think or prepare. Wounded soldiers were lined up for treatment, and the word, "next," was a harsh command that could mean life or death. One surgeon wrote of amputating 12 limbs in a single morning, using the same knife for every patient, simply rinsed in a bucket between uses. Cleaning or sterilization was a concept still far in the future. People feared surgery, but they feared dying slowly even more. A brutal cut was often preferred to rotting alive from infections or gangrene. Abscesses, boils, and tumors sometimes burst spontaneously in large numbers, turning entire villages into chaotic scenes. The smell was so bad that even priests had to stop sermons to pull people out. In a grim way, it was nature's harsh remedy for untreated illness. Even kings weren't safe from the perils of medieval medicine. King Charles II of Navarre was wrapped in brandy, soaked cloth to treat an illness. A practice meant to sterilize wounds, but disastrously backfired when a candle set the cloth on fire. He burned to death, a tragic example of sterilization gone wrong. When royalty could be killed by their own treatments, commoners had even less chance. In medieval thought, surgery was more than physical. It was spiritual. People believed that bleeding could cleanse the soul by purging bad humors and sins. This made surgeons part scientist, part priest. Every incision was a ritual of purification, and pain was considered divine punishment for sin. This belief gave patients a strange form of comfort, almost like medieval Yelp reviews: painful, but spiritually rewarding. 3 stars. Herbs were the main painkillers, though their effectiveness varied widely. Poppies, mandrake, and hemlock were common ingredients, often combined into pungent potions that could dull pain or induce unconsciousness. Sometimes the concoctions were more poison than medicine, but it was the best they had. The search for effective anesthesia was a long and dangerous path. Infections were the biggest threat after surgery. Without knowledge of germs, wounds were left open to contamination. Surgeons used boiling water or vinegar to clean tools, but sterilization was inconsistent at best. The maggot therapy sometimes helped. Certain fly larvae would consume dead tissue and help wounds heal, though this was accidental rather than deliberate. Anatomy was barely understood. Many surgeons worked from classical texts that were often inaccurate or based on animal dissection. Human dissection was forbidden or taboo in many places, so most knowledge was guesswork. This made surgery as much guesswork as skill. Some surgeons had terrifyingly creative, but harmful methods based on superstition. Despite all this, surgery slowly evolved. By the late Middle Ages, universities began teaching more formal anatomy and surgical techniques. Instruments improved, and some surgeons became respected professionals. But even then, surgery was a last resort. Feared, painful, and often fatal. The medieval surgeon's life was a constant battle against nature and ignorance. Imagine having to operate on a patient writhing in pain, with no real anesthesia. Only the dulling effect of a harsh drink or a hit of mandrake wine. The patient's screams mixed with the surgeon's grim determination. Every cut could be the last if infection set in. Surgeons had to be fast, precise, and fearless, traits that earned them both respect and fear. Some surgeries were outright terrifying by modern standards. Trepanation. Drilling a hole in the skull to release evil spirits or pressure was common despite its obvious dangers. Patients who survived were considered lucky or even blessed. But many died from brain damage or infection. It was a gamble between life and death, and often death won. Medical superstition was deeply woven into surgical practice. Surgeons carried amulets, recited prayers, or invoked saints before making incisions. Patients might be sprinkled with holy water or have relics pressed to their wounds. The boundary between medicine and magic was thin and sometimes indistinguishable. This mix of science, faith, and folklore shaped every operation. One story tells of a surgeon who was also a barber, a common dual profession. He would shave a patient's head, cut hair, and perform minor surgeries all in one visit. Barbers were often the only accessible doctors for many people, carrying blades that could both groom and heal. But their skills varied wildly, and many patients never left the barber's chair the same as when they arrived. Yet, despite these challenges, medieval surgeons laid the groundwork for modern medicine. Their crude tools evolved into more precise instruments, and their hands learned techniques still recognizable today. Though often maligned, their work saved countless lives and pushed the boundaries of what was medically possible in their time. Infections were a nightmare. Without antiseptics, even a small wound could turn deadly. Surgeons often saw gangrene, the black, rotting flesh that spread relentlessly on battlefield victims and peasants alike. To stop the infection, amputation was the brutal but necessary solution. The loss of a limb was tragic, but often preferable to death. The psychological toll on surgeons was enormous. They dealt daily with blood, pain, and death. Unlike today's medical professionals, they lacked training in bedside manner or mental health. Many developed a grim, hardened attitude, needed to push through the horrors without breaking. Letters from the period reveal surgeons struggling with guilt and exhaustion. The hospital environment was a far cry from modern clinics. Medieval hospitals were often run by religious orders, focusing more on spiritual care than medical treatment. Patients shared beds and rooms, spreading diseases quickly. Surgery was sometimes performed in chapels or open courtyards, with little privacy or hygiene. The idea of sterile, quiet operating rooms was centuries away. Pain was a constant companion, not only for patients, but for surgeons who had to work swiftly and without precision instruments. It was common for family members or friends to physically hold patients down during procedures. The sheer brutality of the experience often made patients avoid surgery until absolutely necessary, sometimes with fatal consequences. But not all surgeries were grim. Some procedures, like setting broken bones or draining abscesses, brought immediate relief and improvement. Successful surgeries were celebrated, and some surgeons gained fame and patronage from nobility. Still, the stigma of surgery as a dirty and dangerous job lingered for centuries. Anatomical knowledge slowly improved thanks to the Renaissance's curiosity. Dissection of human bodies became more common in universities, though still controversial. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci studied anatomy in great detail, blending art and medicine. This era marked the slow shift from superstition to science. One major breakthrough was the understanding of the circulatory system, which changed how surgeons viewed bleeding and wounds. Bloodletting remained popular, but was gradually refined. The idea that blood flowed in a closed system helped surgeons better control hemorrhages and infections. Surgical instruments improved from crude knives and saws to more specialized tools, scalpels, forceps, and clamps designed for specific tasks. This allowed surgeons to perform more delicate operations. Still, without anesthesia or antibiotics, even the best tools couldn't guarantee survival. Medical texts from this period started to incorporate more observation and experimentation. Surgeons exchanged notes and learned from each other's successes and failures. Guilds and colleges formed to regulate the profession and raise standards, though practices varied greatly by region. Despite progress, many medieval ideas persisted. Bloodletting, humoral theory, and mystical beliefs remained embedded in medicine. Surgery was slowly professionalizing, but remained a dangerous art balancing between hope and horror. The reputation of surgeons began to improve as some gained official status in royal courts. Surgeons like Ambroise Paré, often called the father of modern surgery, revolutionized practices in the 16th century. He introduced ligatures to stop bleeding instead of cauterization, greatly reducing pain and mortality. Paré's innovations reflected a broader trend of empirical observation. He rejected some traditional methods and relied more on trial, error, and careful documentation. His writings became widely influential and marked a turning point toward modern surgical science. Still, surgery remained risky. The absence of reliable anesthesia and antiseptics meant death was a constant threat. Many patients died from shock or infection, even after seemingly successful operations. Surgeons had to be both skilled craftsmen and pragmatists, constantly weighing risks. Public perception evolved too. Surgeons slowly gained respect as healers rather than mere craftsmen or barbers. But the psychological scars of their grim work persisted. Stories from this era reveal surgeons grappling with the emotional burden of failure as much as the physical dangers. By the end of the medieval period, surgery was on the cusp of transformation. The seeds planted by brave, sometimes desperate practitioners would blossom into the medical advances of the Renaissance and beyond. Looking back, it's clear that medieval surgeons lived in a world that was terrifying and unforgiving. Their work was a mix of skill, bravery, superstition, and sheer luck. They endured extreme conditions, often with minimal tools and knowledge, yet managed to save lives that would otherwise have been lost. Their legacy is complex. Many suffered from the stigma attached to their profession, while others became pioneers of a dangerous but essential craft. The mixture of pain, faith, and hope that surrounded medieval surgery reflects a time when science and magic were inseparable. The surgeon's stories remind us how far medicine has come. From bloodied battlefield amputations to sterile operating theaters, the journey spans centuries of trial, error, and human resilience. Every cut made by a medieval surgeon echoed the will to survive in a harsh world. Their courage paved the way for future generations of healers. Though their methods were crude and often brutal, they laid the foundation for modern surgery. The medieval surgeon's tale is one of endurance, adaptation, and the eternal struggle to save life against overwhelming odds. In the end, the question, why it sucked to be a medieval surgeon, isn't just about the pain or danger. It's about the weight of responsibility carried without the tools or knowledge we take for granted today. It's about facing the unknown with steady hands and a brave heart, knowing every mistake could be fatal. Their world was one where hope and horror lived side by side, where cutting into flesh was both a last resort and a desperate chance, and where survival depended as much on faith and fortune as on skill and science. So when you hear the tale of the medieval surgeon, remember the blood, the sweat, and the tears behind every blade. Remember the quiet heroes who faced the worst to give others a chance at life. because in their struggle lies the roots of every modern miracle medicine now performs. Not every town had a surgeon, but those that did often kept a space behind the workshop, away from the main roads, behind shuttered windows, where they kept what they called the bone room. It wasn't a room in the formal sense. It was more like a place where things went to not be seen. In one such village, this room belonged to a man named Ulrich. His patients called him the Hand. Not out of flattery, but because he'd lost one of his own in a cart accident and replaced it with a crude metal hook. He did everything with his left hand now: cut, cauterize, stitch, slowly, carefully, and never without a prayer. The bone room was lined with shelves, some stacked with old skulls used for training, others with jars filled with herbs that had long lost their scent. Hanging from the rafters were rows of bandages, drying. Below them, a table stained black from years of blood. Some said you could still hear the screaming in the wood if you listened close enough at night. Ulrich was not a cruel man, but he was not gentle either. He had grown tired of pretending that pain was anything other than a gate, something you had to walk through, alone, and hope you emerged from whole on the other side. He rarely spoke during procedures. He simply worked, and if you made it through, he nodded once and moved on. One evening, a blacksmith came in with his forearm burned down to the bone. A forge accident. Ulrich examined the wound, looked the man in the eyes, and said only, "It must come off." The blacksmith nodded. Neither man asked for more words than that. The townsfolk watched from the doorway as the surgery took place. The smell of burning flesh from the cautery iron wafted down the lane. A child fainted. The blacksmith didn't scream. He grit his teeth and recited the names of every horse he'd ever owned. He made it to the 12th name before passing out. Later that night, Ulrich sat alone in the bone room. He looked at the severed arms still on the table, then at his own metal hook, then back again. Were not healers, he whispered to no one. Were reminders. Outside it started to rain. In the monastery of St. Arden's Hollow, hidden beneath stone arches and ivy, there was a book known only as Liber Sanguis, the Book of Blood. It wasn't bound in human skin, despite rumors. It wasn't cursed or forbidden. It was worse. It was used. Brother Caldus was its keeper, a man more scholar than monk, who had trained in distant lands and brought back something rare to medieval Europe: observation. While most barbers guessed their way through a surgery, Caldus wrote everything down. Every success, every failure, every death. The book held sketches of tools, diagrams of bone fractures, and notes about which herbs eased pain and which killed quietly. Most monks ignored it. They whispered that Brother Caldus was obsessed, touched in the head. But when the town's mayor was run through with a lance, it was Caldus they called. He opened the wound with clean tools. Rare, even revolutionary. He stitched it with silk soaked in vinegar. He prayed, not for God's blessing, but that the vinegar wouldn't sting too deeply. The mayor survived, and for a while, the monastery was seen not just as a place of faith, but of healing. But the church did not smile kindly on surgery, no matter how clean. The human body was sacred. To cut it was to desecrate it. Caldus was summoned by the bishop, accused of dissecting God's work. The Book of Blood was confiscated. He was reassigned to a quiet posting in the north, one where no one asked questions, and no one brought wounded men in the night. The book was hidden again, locked beneath a floorboard in the scriptorium. Forgotten. Until decades later, when plague came roaring through the valleys like fire through dry leaves. Then suddenly, people remembered Caldus, and they came looking for his notes, But by then, the ink had faded, and so had the chance to save them. In the port city of Kaldowicz, nestled between the salt-drenched docks and the market square, lived a man named Rorek. He was known not as a healer, but as a knife master. His reputation was whispered in the taverns, not praised in the chapels. It was said he could take a leg in under 20 seconds, and if the man lived, he'd buy him a drink. Rorek had an apprentice, Milo, barely 16, with trembling hands and eyes that had seen too much already. Milo had watched his brother die of infection after a bad wound was left to fester. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to understand. He wanted to be better. The first time Milo held a bone saw, he dropped it. Rorek didn't scold him. He simply said, "You'll drop it again. Better now than when someone's watching." It was the only kindness he ever offered. One night, they received a sailor with a gangrenous foot. The room stank before the man even entered. Rorek pointed. "Yours," he said. Milo froze. But he set the leg, tied the tourniquet, and began to cut. The blade caught on cartilage. The bone splintered under pressure. The sailor howled, then passed out. Milo's hands didn't stop shaking for 2 days. Rorek never congratulated him. But the next morning, he handed Milo a new saw wrapped in cloth. "Clean steel," he said. "Don't waste it." That was how Rorek taught, in silence, in blood, and in scars. There were wounds a surgeon could see: a slash, a burn, a break. But the most feared were the ones hidden beneath the skin. When the belly swelled, or the chest filled with fluid, or the mind began to turn against itself. In those cases, a blade was not a tool. It was a coin tossed into the dark. One such case came to a healer named Jutha, a woman who had worked in the back rooms of brothels and merchant inns, places where pain was common and shame was constant. A boy had been brought in, fevered and bloated, his abdomen hard as oak. The local barber had refused to touch him, said it was demon rot. Jutha ignored him. She boiled a small knife, whispered apologies to the unconscious boy, and cut into the swelling. Pus burst out like a dam breaking. The stench was unbearable. She didn't flinch. She packed the wound with cloth soaked in vinegar and wine. The boy lived. Barely. But for weeks, he lay still, weeping without sound. Jutha visited him each night, telling him stories about stars, rivers, and horses. She called it healing too, just of a different kind. In the great University of Eldmere, where medicine was taught by men who had never seen a battlefield, a young student named Harlan made a discovery. He realized most of what they taught was wrong. He'd dissected pigs. He'd sketched organs. He'd even watched 2 surgeries, though both men had died. But what shocked him most was the absence of pain in their diagrams. The book spoke of arteries and nerves like threads and pipes, but not once did they mention the agony of flesh cut open while the mind still screamed inside it. So Harlan did something no student had done before. He added pain to his notes, described the trembling, the breathless pauses, the way the pupils dilated. He wrote of screams as symptoms. His professors were horrified. One said, "This is not science." Harlan replied, "Then what use is your science if it can't name a man's suffering?" He never graduated. We imagined that filth was simply accepted, that no one cared about washing hands or scrubbing tools. But some did. A few surgeons noticed that when they rinsed their blades, their patients lived longer. They called it luck. A pattern. A ritual. But not science. One surgeon, Adrian of Calais, boiled his instruments. Not because of germs. He didn't know the word. But because he said the spirit of rot feared heat. His patients often fared better. He was laughed at for it. He died poor, but with cleaner hands than most. Mistakes in medieval surgery were not measured in lawsuits. They were measured in graves. A man named Rellan came in with a shattered leg. The surgeon, new, confident, marked the wrong limb. By the time the patient woke, the healthy leg was gone. Rellan lived another year, begging in the streets. He would shout, "They cut off the part of me that still worked," before collapsing into drink and silence. Not all surgeons stayed. Some disappeared. In the town of Holmer, 3 surgeons worked for nearly a decade. Then one spring, they left. No letters, no goodbyes. Only their tools remained, laid out in perfect order on the long table, as if still waiting to be picked up. The townsfolk believed they had gone mad, or had seen something during a surgery they could not unsee. A glimpse of the soul escaping. A truth too sharp to carry. No one entered that room again. It was sealed. The dust gathered. The tools rusted. But the table remained clean. There is a tale, perhaps only half true, of a woman named Elson who removed her own gallstone with a kitchen knife. No surgeon would treat her. They said the pain would kill her. So she waited until the night before her wedding, drank 2 bottles of wine, bit down on a towel, and cut. She screamed once, then fell silent. She awoke covered in blood. The stone was gone. The wound would heal crooked. But she married the next day, walking with a slight limp, and a scar that she called her second ring. Many patients never agreed to their surgeries. They were unconscious, or delirious, or simply told, "There's no other way." Consent wasn't a form. It was a nod, a blink, a cry. Some tried to escape mid-procedure. Others were strapped down with ropes. One man broke 3 ribs trying to flee the table. They operated anyway. The body was not sacred. It was stubborn. And sometimes, the only way to heal it was to hold it down and hope it forgave you. Gerrit of Norhill never spoke during a procedure. Not once. No prayers, no instructions. He didn't bark orders or whisper comforts. Just silence. His hands moved like he was sewing cloth, not flesh. Precise. Cold. Efficient. People feared him, but they also lined up at his door. Gerrit believed words got in the way. That pain spoke its own language, and when his patients cried out, he didn't flinch. He just tightened the tourniquet and kept cutting. Some said he had no soul. Others said he'd seen too many of them leaving bodies to bother talking anymore. A woman named Salvi brought her daughter to the abbey with a tumor on her back. Round, warm, growing. The monks prayed. The barber examined. But quietly, like she didn't want to bother the world. They cut. The mass was deeper than expected. The blood came fast, like it was escaping something. The girl died before they finished closing her skin. For weeks after, Salvi returned to the abbey steps, sitting in silence. The monks offered food. She refused. Her daughter had died on sacred ground. That was miracle enough, she said. In the village of Droven, a surgeon named Eldwin used coins as anesthesia, not to pay, but to distract. He'd press a silver piece into the patient's palm and say, "Keep your mind here." The poor focused so hard on the coin, they forgot the blade. It didn't always work, but it gave the illusion of control. One man gripped his coin so tightly during a finger amputation that the imprint of the king's face stayed in his palm for 3 days. He said it felt like someone else had held his hand the whole time. In some cities, bleeding became its own profession. The Bleeders Guild was real, recognized by lords and cities. They weren't surgeons. They were experts in balancing humors. Their tools, knives, bowls, leeches. Their skill, timing. A good bleeder could drain a pent in minutes and leave the patient standing. A bad one left them slumped, grey, and hollow-eyed. There were apprenticeships, exams. One town even had a bleeder of the month. None of them lived past 50. In the far hills of Mersin, there was a chapel built without nails. Its beams were joined by wood alone, interlocked like the ribs of a patient sewn shut. The villagers claimed it was a sacred place where no blood could be spilled. But one winter, a traveller collapsed near its steps with a gaping wound. The local healer dragged him inside, stitched him with needle and wine, and saved his life. The next day, the chapel's door refused to close. It stayed open for years, like a mouth, forever shocked by what had happened inside. After the Black Death swept through, surgeons were never the same. Before, they'd seen wounds. Now, they saw what illness truly meant: breathless nights, blackened toes, children stacked in carts. They learned to work faster and dirtier, but also gentler. Death was no longer a possibility. It was a neighbor. Some barbers threw out their tools. Others sharpened them more. The world didn't become cleaner after the plague, just quieter. In a small hamlet, a midwife named Moira performed more surgeries than any man for 60 miles. She delivered babies, drained abscesses, pulled teeth, and once even removed a splintered rib from a farmer's chest. But her most famous operation, her husband's hand, crushed in a mill accident. No one else would operate, so she did. And she didn't blink. Afterward, she sewed his wound shut and whispered, "Now you'll finally listen to me." He never talked back again. Some surgeons did pray, but not for healing. They prayed for aim, for steady hands, for clean breaks, for short screams. One surgeon carved a short prayer into the underside of his saw handle: "Lord, let them wake tomorrow." Sometimes they did. He eventually retired, gave the saw to his son, and burned the apron he'd worn for 30 years. Said it was the only piece of clothing that ever learned to breathe. Most patients tried to forget, but a few never did. A soldier with one leg returned to the surgeon every year and left a single copper coin on the doorstep. He never spoke, never knocked, just left the coin and limped away. But of course, surgery wasn't the only thing that hurt in the Middle Ages. If you think the blade was bad, wait until you meet the man with the pliers. Because next, we're stepping into the cracked, infected, and utterly terrifying world of medieval dentistry. They didn't call them dentists. They were known as tooth drawers. And their names were spoken in the same breath as executioners and tax collectors. You didn't go to them unless you had no other choice. There were no clinics, no waiting rooms, no scented gloves. The tooth drawer sat outside the market square with a wooden stool, a bucket, and a small table of iron tools, most of them rusted and some visibly stained. His hands were cracked from cold, rough with calluses. He didn't ask where the pain was. He pointed, and you obeyed. His apron told the story of 100 screams, and just as many mistakes. Tooth pain in the Middle Ages wasn't a nuisance. It was torment. Deep, constant, and without relief. A cavity meant rot. Rot meant swelling, fevers, difficulty eating or speaking, and eventually death if it travelled inward. There were no fillings, no root canals, no anesthetic whispers in sterile rooms. Just a desperate hope that the pain might stop after the pliers did their job. If you were lucky, you found a drawer who worked quickly. If not, you found one who braced his knee against your chest, held your jaw in a cracked leather strap, and yanked with iron. And if that didn't work the first time, he'd twist or dig. The tools were kept in pouches of rags or dangling from belts like charms. Some were made by blacksmiths who had no idea they'd be used for mouths. Others were fashioned from old hooks, twisted spoons, or broken tongs. Each one had a name whispered behind closed doors: the cranker, the turner, the hooked lady. People swore some tools had taken more lives than swords. Pain was not the only danger. Infection was constant. Few drawers cleaned their tools. Some wiped them on their aprons. Others dipped them briefly in wine or passed them through smoke. Believing it killed the demons that caused tooth rot. It didn't. Infections festered quickly. Gums turned black. Fever followed. Many died days later, whispering prayers and clutching rosaries. One tooth drawer in Barrow's Hollow operated out of a stall wedged between the butcher and the fishmonger. He kept a pig's head on a spike as a kind of twisted mascot. People said he practiced on it when business was slow. Children called him Pigjaw. Adults avoided his eyes. But he was the only drawer in town, and when the pain came, they lined up. There was no diagnosis, no second opinions. If a patient pointed to their upper left molar and winced, the drawer would glance once and go in. He never confirmed. And often, he didn't wait for consent. One pull for one coin. That was the rule. The sounds haunted the street. The clink of metal, the grunts, the crack, wet and sharp, like splitting firewood in the rain. Some screamed. Others sat stone still, eyes wide, shaking long after the tooth came free. The bravest cried later, in the quiet. A priest once described the drawer's work as a sacrament of pain. He said it with no humor. He meant it, and if you're wondering about replacements, there were none. No implants, no veneers. A pulled tooth was simply gone. Some rich folk tried ivory or carved wood. Others pushed small stones or bones into the gaps. But most just lived with the space, or died from the empty wound. And yet, somehow, they returned. Every week. Every month. There were always more teeth to pull. More pain to quiet. And more drawers who swore they knew what they were doing. Some did. Most didn't. To understand how brutal dentistry truly was in the medieval world, you have to look at the tools. They weren't made for comfort or precision. They were forged for grip and leverage, not finesse. Thick, cruel, and heavy. They looked more like butcher's implements than anything to do with healing. Some were shaped like keys, others like fish hooks. One notorious model, the Pelican, had curved arms and a screw mechanism that was meant to wrap around the tooth and yank it upward. It often yanked more than that. Gums tore, jawbones cracked. Sometimes teeth came out clean, but sometimes bits stayed behind. Roots, splinters, shards, and the pain that followed. Unholy. A drawer's belt might clink like a jailer's. Rows of iron, blades, hooks, twisted clamps. When the patient sat down, the noise alone was enough to make some flee. But if you stayed, the drawer would open his pouch like a priest before a ritual. And it was a ritual, just not a sacred one. You might be held down by relatives. You might be blindfolded. You might be asked to bite on a strap or piece of wood. But you wouldn't be warned. The philosophy was simple: pain was expected. Screaming meant it was working. To dull the pain, some drawers used alcohol. Not for the patient, for themselves. One famous drawer in Eastminster drank a cup of mead before every pull. To steady the hand, he said. He was famous for pulling the wrong teeth. If you were rich, maybe you'd get opium. If you were poor, you got prayer. Or nothing. Either way, the pain came, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always loud. Records from the 1300s describe extractions lasting up to 5 minutes. 5 minutes of twisting, grinding, pleading. And afterward, there was no antiseptic, no gauze, just pressure. Bleeding stopped when it stopped. Infection started when it started. And most drawers never saw their patients again. Not because they healed, but because they couldn't come back. Tools were rarely cleaned. The same forceps used on a beggar in the morning might be used on a knight's wife by afternoon. Disease didn't discriminate, but drawers did. Poor patients got bare hangs. Rich ones got rags. Drawers often reused bandages, cloths, or straps until they rotted. They said the stains proved their experience. Clean tools. One drawer said, mean no business. Yet, a few tried. A handful of drawers boiled water, washed hands, learned to steady their grip. One even recorded which tools worked best on which teeth. But these were exceptions. Most drawers lived by feel. And too often, they relied on force. The tools didn't lie about their purpose, but they lied about their cost. And for the patient, that cost was almost always more than just one tooth. Tooth drawing wasn't just medicine, it was business. And like all medieval business, it thrived on desperation, fear, and spectacle. Drawers competed for attention. Some wore colorful robes. Others claimed to be blessed by saints or trained in distant kingdoms. Their stalls bore symbols of bones, skulls, and red, stained cloth. Crowds gathered not just for relief, but for the show. Watching someone else scream was a distraction from their own pain. Market days were prime. The drawer would set up his tools on a blood-warped cloth, shout rhymed advertisements. 1 coin for peace, 2 for grace. I'll yank the pain clean from your face! He had no need for trust. Only coin. And a steady line of mouths too swollen to speak. The worst part? It worked. In a way. Pain, after all, was its own advertisement. People limped away holding their faces, but they limped away. Word spread, and the line grew. But drawers weren't always self-taught butchers. Some were apprentices, passed down from master to student. A young boy might start by boiling tools, then holding heads, then steadying arms. By the time he reached adulthood, his fingers were already shaped by the pressure of forceps. His soul, too. There were no licenses, no guilds, only reputation. A drawer who pulled too slow might find himself pelted with rotten vegetables. One who pulled too fast, risking breaks or deeper trauma, might simply vanish after too many deaths. A quiet grave in a quiet village. And then there were the herbalists. Women, mostly. Midwives turned tooth healers. They used clove oil, salt compresses, and tinctures made from willow bark. Their success angered drawers. Men mocked their ways, until their own wives begged for those hands instead. One woman, Isabeth of Norwich, became famous for her poultices. She claimed they could ease a tooth's pain enough for it to fall out on its own. Drawers hated her, but people travelled for miles to see her. She took no coin, only traded for flour, cloth, or silence. Despite this, most people still turned to drawers. The pain was immediate, but so was the solution. And in a time when time was short, when infections killed within days, a fast solution beat a gentle one. Some drawers began branding teeth with small cuts after pulling them, tossing them into prayer piles by the altar, believing it lessened their karmic burden. Others whispered to the teeth before dropping them in jars. Confessions of guilt, promises to improve, pleas for forgiveness. And still, the business grew. No matter how much it hurt, no matter how many died, because every village had teeth, and eventually every tooth failed, and every drawer waited. It was rarely the tooth that killed you. It was what came after. The drawer's work didn't end at the pull. In truth, it only started there. What came next, days or even hours later, was the part that truly defined medieval dentistry: infection. Swelling, fever, blackened gums. A dull ache that became sharp. A sharp pain that spread through your jaw and into your throat, and sometimes, if you were truly unfortunate, into your chest. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics. Once a drawer finished his task, your body was on its own. Blood pooled in your mouth. The wound stayed open. You bit down on cloth or fingers, or nothing at all. The bleeding stopped when it stopped. Or it didn't. And when it didn't, the rot set in. Survivors often described a sweet, sickly taste before the fever arrived. A taste that clung to the tongue like smoke. You couldn't eat. You couldn't sleep. You drank broth, if someone cared enough to make it. Otherwise, you lay in bed and prayed. Because there was nothing else to do. One woman in the village of Oadby survived a molar extraction only to find herself unable to open her jaw days later. Her mouth locked tight. Her husband, desperate, pried it open with a knife and burned her gum with a hot coin. She screamed for hours. She lived, but never spoke again. In another case, a young stable boy had his front tooth pulled. Within days, his face had swollen so badly he couldn't see out of one eye. His breath smelled of decay. The local priest claimed it was demonic. The drawer said it was natural consequence. The boy died a week later. His family planted an apple tree over his grave and said no one would eat its fruit. Even drawers feared the infection. They worked fast, not just to limit pain, but to reduce exposure. Some believed the tooth rot could travel into their own skin if they touched it too long. Gloves didn't exist. A few wrapped hands in linen, but most used bare fingers. They wiped them on aprons or grass, or whatever cloth was nearby. Mouths were dirty, but drawers didn't understand bacteria. They believed rot was a punishment, either for gluttony, or lust, or simply for being poor. Some drawers kept holy symbols around their stalls. Others hung herbs from rafters to ward off the spirits of sickness. It didn't help. People still died. Quietly. Slowly. One village, Radcom, lost 6 children in a single summer, all from infected extractions. The drawer fled in the night. They found his stall burned. His tools rusted and left in a pile. For years after, the villagers refused to speak his name. They only called him the one who pulled too much. Even successful extractions were marked with risk. If a fragment of tooth remained, a jagged sliver buried deep, your body might treat it as poison. Abscesses formed. Gums ballooned. Sometimes, the eye bulged or the tongue stiffened. If the infection reached the bloodstream, it was over. Some healers tried to clean the wound. They used salt or wine or herbal mixtures packed into the socket. Occasionally, it helped. Mostly, it delayed the inevitable. The wound reeked. The fever burned. A few lucky ones survived with misshapen jaws and darkened skin. They were called half-faces. There was no shame in being disfigured, just pity and fear. Some claimed survivors could spread their sickness through breath or touch, so they were often avoided. Or worse, banished. One man, Wylan of Durnmere, had 12 teeth pulled over the course of 2 years. Only 5 were infected. The others were taken by mistake, or fear. His face collapsed inward. He wore a mask made from bark, tied behind his head with sheep gut. He painted a smile on it. They say it was the only smile he had left. Infection didn't just kill bodies, it killed spirits. Those who survived often lost their ability to laugh, to chew, to speak clearly. Some carried vials of rose water to rinse the smell from their mouths. Others just stayed quiet. And drawers. They kept drawing. Because every infection began with a pull. But every pull began with pain. And pain never ran out. In medieval society, the mouth wasn't just the source of pain. It was a symbol. A place where sin entered and where suffering emerged. To speak too boldly, to eat too greedily, to kiss too freely. All were considered transgressions that might invite divine punishment. And when the punishment came, it often came through pain in the mouth. Some priests told parishioners their tooth-aches were penance for gossip. Others said they were signs of gluttony. The idea that pain had meaning, moral meaning. was common, which made treatment not just medical, but spiritual and dangerous. Public punishments sometimes involved the mouth. A liar might have a tooth yanked in front of a crowd. A thief could be gagged for a week, and adulterers, some were branded on the lips, or had their tongues nicked to let the lust drain out. These weren't punishments from drawers, but from priests and magistrates. Still, they blurred the line between justice and dentistry. The drawers, of course, capitalized on this fear. They whispered that they could remove more than pain. They could remove sin. One even claimed to pull the tongue root of lies, charging extra for anyone who confessed before sitting down. But the fear wasn't just among the poor. Nobles were terrified of losing teeth. A missing front tooth was a sign of weakness, so they wore fake ones, carved from ivory or shaped from bone. They tied them in place with gold wire. It helped with appearances, but not with pain. The wire often dug into the gums. Some teeth fell into their food. Others stayed lodged until the jaw decayed. There's a story of a duchess who kept a personal drawer on staff. He had only one job: ensure she never lost a tooth. He rubbed her gums with lavender oil nightly, polished her teeth with rabbit fur, fed her soft figs and warm milk. Despite all this, her molars rotted anyway. When she died, they found a pouch of 6 pulled teeth sewn into her pillow. Her chambermaid said she thought she could sleep the pain away. Children were no safer. Baby teeth were often pulled if they looked crooked. Parents feared their children would grow up devil, mouthed, or cursed. One boy, only 7, had 8 teeth removed in a single sitting. He didn't speak for months. When he finally did, it was in whispers. In some towns, drawers operated beside executioners. Not in role, but in reputation. They both dealt in agony. They both kept their tools sharp. They both believed in the importance of swift pain. But drawers worked on the living, and the living sometimes screamed. Poets wrote about the mouth as a battlefield. Teeth like soldiers, gums as trenches. When war was lost, the jaw fell silent. The words were metaphor, but not by much. There was a woman, Anesthesia of Solmare, who was said to be too honest. She spoke harsh truths, challenged priests. One day, she was dragged to the drawer's chair. No trial, no crime, just too many complaints. He pulled 4 of her teeth in front of the mayor. When she bled too much, they burned her mouth with salt. She lived, and afterward she never stopped speaking. In this world, pain was not always the result of illness. Sometimes, it was weaponized. A drawer could be hired to extract a rival's teeth, not all at once, but one by one, quietly, over months, under the guise of treatment. There were no laws against this, only pain, and the hope that no one noticed, and sometimes they didn't. To become a tooth drawer was not a matter of education or title. It was a matter of watching, copying, and surviving. The apprentice didn't start with tools. He started with silence, with wide eyes, with hands that trembled at the sight of blood. And if those hands kept trembling too long, they were sent away. Most apprentices were boys, though not all. Some were sons of drawers. Others were orphans taken in by those desperate enough to trade food for help. They learned first to hold heads still, then to press cloth against bleeding mouths. Then, if they were lucky, or unlucky enough, to survive a year, they were given the iron. The first pull was never forgotten. It was rarely clean. The angle was wrong. The grip too loose. The scream too sudden. Apprentices learned to keep their eyes open and their stomachs closed. One apprentice, Farron, vomited on his first patient. The drawer laughed. The patient didn't. Drawers rarely taught through words. They taught through repetition, through bruises, and through blood. An apprentice who dropped a tool had to sleep outside. One who cut too deep had to pull the next 3 with bare hands. This was how skills passed, not gently, but with scars. Some drawers kept journals, not of techniques, but of patience. Sketches of jaws, scribbles of names, tallies of screams. A rare few recorded mistakes. Those were the best teachers, but most apprentices didn't last. Some left in the night, teeth rattling in their pockets. Others went mad from the noise. There's a tale of one boy, only 14, who began to believe teeth carried memories. He lined his room with them, tiny trophies of pain. When they found him, he was whispering to a molar as if it were his mother. The apprentices who endured became the next generation of drawers. Hardened, efficient, detached, they stopped seeing faces, they saw only mouths. A job to be done, a price to be paid. And yet, not all lost their humanity. One girl, Maylin, apprenticed under a drawer known for cruelty. But she hid salves in her apron, slipped herbs into her patients' mouths when her master looked away. When she finally took over, she became known as the Gentle Hook. People came from towns away just to be pulled by her hand. But even she couldn't avoid the truth. Apprentices became drawers. And drawers were instruments of pain. There was no guild, no ceremony, only a moment the first time an apprentice pulled without flinching, without apology, without fear. That moment, they said, was when the pliers became part of you. And for many, that was the scariest part of all. Some drawers didn't shout. They didn't bargain in markets or hold court like showmen. They didn't hang blood-soaked banners or boast about their body counts. These were the quiet drawers, the ones who worked in basements, monasteries, and darkened corners of back alleys. And while they lacked flair, they were no less feared. Their tools were not the sharpened steel of merchants, but the worn iron of ritual. Some had custom handles wrapped in cloth. Others had notches carved for every 10th pull. A few smelled of lavender or smoke, depending on where they had last been hidden. These tools didn't gleam, they whispered. One such drawer, old Brina, worked from a candlelit cellar beneath a grain shop. She was half blind and walked with a limp, but her hands were steady, and her silence more terrifying than any scream. She never explained her methods. She simply pointed, and you sat. If you hesitated, she would close the door and not open it again. The quiet drawers believed in presence over power. Their rooms were sparse. No skulls, no bones, no trophies. Just a chair, a table, a rag, and sometimes a prayer. But what they offered in stillness, they often lacked in mercy. Braina used heat, not for sterilization. She didn't believe in infection, but for control. She would warm her tools until they steamed, then let them cool in the air as you watched. Cold steel forgets, she'd say. Hot steel remembers. One boy who visited her emerged without a tooth, but with a silence that lasted years. When he finally spoke again, it was only to say, she told the pain to leave. It listened. Another drawer, the quiet man of Feldsbridge, refused to look his patients in the eyes. He wore a veil over his mouth and nose, not for health, but to keep from smelling the rot. His tools were tied to cords on the ceiling, swinging above his head like iron fruit. He'd reach up, pick one and begin. He never asked questions, never answered them. He hummed, sometimes, tuneless and low. The villagers claimed he'd once been a singer who lost his voice to infection, and now pulled teeth to pay for the songs he could no longer sing. These quiet drawers had no apprentices. Their craft died with them. No one was eager to follow their path. Too lonely, too strange, too haunted. But those who sat in their chairs never forgot them. The silence, the stillness, the strange calm before the storm. Because sometimes, the worst pain didn't come with shouting. It came with a whisper. The battlefield spared no part of the body. But perhaps no wound was so underestimated and so agonizing as a shattered jaw. When soldiers returned from war, they often carried injuries that no one knew how to treat. Limbs were lost, eyes ruined, bellies pierced. Yet, when a man came home with broken teeth, dislocated jaws, or fragments of arrowheads lodged in his gums, there was no glory, only silence and agony. Drawers rarely followed armies, but some were pulled into their service, not by choice, but by desperation. They weren't paid in gold, but in food, in shelter, in protection. And the wounds they treated were rarely clean. Often, the teeth had been shattered by hilt strikes, by fists, by flung stones. Sometimes by fear, men grinding so hard in sleep that their molars cracked in half. A soldier named Dane was once brought into a monastery with half his face caved in. He had no words left, only gurgling sounds. The monks prayed. The surgeon hesitated, but the drawer, brought in from a nearby village, looked him over and said, "Give me a forge and a barrel of snow." No one knows exactly what he did. But Dane lived. His mouth never closed right again, and his speech was slurred. Yet he became a local tale, not of survival, but of quiet repair. They said the drawer melted down a horseshoe and used it to brace the jaw. Dane called it his iron prayer. Teeth broken in war were rarely pulled clean. They shattered in place, leaving bloody craters and stabbing splinters. Soldiers with these wounds often lost the ability to eat. Starvation came quietly. Some drawers tied linen strips, soaked in wine around the mouth to hold pieces in place. Others simply pulled until nothing remained. And yet the war never asked how it happened. A man who returned with no teeth was expected to lift a sword by morning. The pain was seen as penance. An old commander once said, "If you still feel your mouth, it means your heart is working. Now pick up your weapon." Some drawers kept bone fragments from the mouths of warriors. Splinters etched with initials or battle names. They wrapped them in cloth and carried them like talismans. For luck, for memory, for a grim kind of pride. In battlefield camps, it was not uncommon for a drawer to pull 10 teeth in a night. No lamps, no silence. Just the groans of men who'd survived the spear, only to fall to the pliers. There were no beds. Patients sat or leaned against tent poles. The drawer worked by firelight, his hands blackened with soot and blood. The wind carried the screams. The soldiers bit on leather, on sticks, on the hems of their own cloaks. One man bit off his own tongue during a jaw reset. He bled out by dawn. And for every man treated, 5 more waited, or died waiting. There was no rest for the drawer, no thanks, no recognition. Just teeth, always more teeth. Some wrote letters home with broken mouths, words slurred across the parchment like blood across a field. Others didn't write at all. Their pain had swallowed their voices. The battlefield didn't forgive. But neither did the drawer's chair, and the pain that war began. It followed them home, and in the quietest rooms, pain echoed longest. In the marshlands near Varnwick stood a house with no sign. No windows, and only one door. Twisted oak, scorched black, and sealed with a single iron nail. They called it the House of Ash and Bone. Few spoke its real name. Fewer still approached it. It wasn't a place of healing. Not really. But when mouths swelled and throats closed, when neighbors wept in pain too loud for sleep, they came. Not out of faith, but out of exhaustion. The drawer who lived there had no apprentices, no visitors, no recorded lineage. She was old, older than the town, they said, and silent. Her name, if it had ever been known, was gone. The children called her Mother Hook. She used no tools made by man. Her pliers were shaped from bone, antler, horn, something older. Her thread was hair. Her salves burned like fire, but left no scars. Her home smelled of salt, smoke, and river mud. And when you entered, you did not speak. You opened your mouth. She would look, pause, and begin. There were no chairs. You lay flat on a stone slab slick with moss, warmed from beneath. Candles dripped red wax into bowls filled with teeth, some cracked, some perfect. She hummed as she worked, softly, tunelessly. Some believed she was a witch. Others said she had been a noble surgeon who fled after a failed operation. Still more whispered she had no tongue, and spoke through pain alone. Those who entered rarely returned with stories. They left clutching their jaws, faces pale. Some swore they heard voices in the walls. Others claimed to see faces in the candlelight, faces not their own. One man said he watched his own tooth beg not to be taken. But the pain was always gone. For a price. Always a price. Some paid in coin, others in memory. One widow gave her wedding ring. A beggar offered his name. A boy, too young to understand pain, gave her his voice and never spoke again. A town never questioned what she did. They feared her, but they needed her. When the other drawers failed, she remained. When the infection returned, she cured. When the screams wouldn't stop, she silenced them. Until one winter, when the river froze and no one came. The pain lessened, the infection slowed, and the house of ash and bones stood silent. When spring came, they found the door wide open. Inside, nothing but ash. No bones, no candles, no pliers. Only a smooth, dark slab, and on it, a single white tooth. Perfect. Untouched, as if it had never known pain at all. There's a ruin just north of Carrow's Bend. A crumbled chapel surrounded by stunted trees and blackened stones. Its roof is long gone. The bell split in two. But beneath the floor, in the cold soil, lie over 30 graves. Unmarked, unblessed. Each one, they say, belonged to a singer. The choir without tongues. Centuries ago, the abbey housed a choir famed across the region. Voices so clear, so piercing, they were believed to cure sadness. People came from miles to hear them sing vespers in the morning light. But then, one winter, the voices stopped. The choir boys grew sick. Their jaws ached, their gums blood. One by one, they were taken to the drawer. The abbey drawer was no mere peddler. He had trained in Italy. He believed in diagrams, technique, sterility. But he also believed in silence. He refused to work with witnesses. When the boys entered his chamber, they were alone. When they returned, they didn't speak. Their teeth were gone. Their voices too. Some said it was infection. Others said it was something more, something deeper. A punishment, a bargain. A silence traded for perfection. The last boy, Thomas, tried to write what he saw, but his hands trembled. He drew only shapes, sharp, circular, spiraling. The monks burned the pages. And then, the abbey closed its gates. Years later, travelers reported hearing faint singing from the chapel at dawn. Melodies without words, chords without breath. They called it the choir's echo. A priest tried to exorcise the ruins. He stood in the choir pit and shouted scripture. His voice cracked, his gums bled. He died within a week. No one has tried since. Today, the stones lie quiet. Moss covers the altar. The wind hums through the choir's bones. And somewhere, beneath the earth, a drawer sleeps, waiting for the next song to silence. They say power shields men from suffering, but no crown could keep pain from the mouth. In the court of King Edrand Thru, the halls were filled with the scent of incense, the rustle of fine silk, and the whispers of men too afraid to speak the truth. The king was not cruel, but he was proud. And when his molar began to rot, no one dared name it. The pain started as a flicker, a nuisance behind his cheek. But within days, his temper flared. He shouted at ministers, banished cooks, accused his steward of treason for overboiling wine. All because of a tooth. Physicians came in droves. They prodded with silver hooks and dabbed with saffron paste. They chanted prayers and burned sage. But the pain stayed. It grew. Then came the drawer. His name was Croy. He did not wear velvet or speak in poetry. He carried no banner and bowed only once. He walked into the throne room like a butcher into a barn. And the king, red-eyed and desperate, let him. Croy examined the mouth. The court watched, horrified, as he nodded. "Rot's in the root," he said. "It must come out." There was no velvet chair, no private chamber. Croy laid the king flat on a banquet table. Ministers turned away. The queen fainted, and as the drawer reached for his tool, "A twisted piece of black iron," he said only. "Bite this." The king bit a rolled scroll of treaties. It snapped when the drawer twisted. The scream that followed was not kingly. It echoed through stone, through garden, through chapel. The tooth came out black as coal. The blood was thick as stew. When it was over, Croy didn't bow. He simply dropped the tooth into a bowl and said, "It's done." Then he left, dragging his tool sack behind him. No reward, no feast. But the king lived, and never smiled again. They say the tooth was kept in the royal treasury, alongside rubies and relics, a reminder that power bends before pain. Years later, a painter commissioned to do the king's portrait asked why he never showed his teeth. The king replied, "Because it cost me more than war." In the valley town of Greld, nestled between two cliffs and 3 unpaved roads, there was a tradition. Every midwinter, after the livestock was culled and the cider tapped, the townsfolk would hold a feast, not of celebration, but of resilience. The Feast of Broken Teeth. No one remembers how it began. Some say a famine forced them to chew bone for broth. Others say it was an act of protest. After the Lord's steward forbade soup and demanded dry bread. But whatever its origin, the tradition held strong. On the night of the feast, no soft food was served. Only crusted loaves, burned meat, candied walnuts, and boiled roots that cracked like glass between the teeth. Those who lost a tooth during the feast were considered blessed, proof they had endured. The drawer was central to the ritual. He sat beside the fire, tools lined neatly across a pine table. A bucket of snow waited to catch the pain. He wore no mask, no robe, only a red sash and an iron medallions, a tooth crowned in flame. As the feast went on, he examined mouths by firelight. When a tooth came loose, he pulled it without pause and dropped it into a brass basin filled with cider. At the end of the night, the basin was carried to the cliff's edge and poured into the wind. "Let the pain return to stone," they said. But there were darker stories. Some said the drawer chose the wrong teeth on purpose, that he kept the ones with gold caps or smooth enamel, that he whispered to each before placing them in the basin, asking them not to scream. One year, a boy bit into his first walnut and spat blood. The drawer came. But the tooth was whole. He pulled it anyway. The boy cried until sunrise. Another year, no one lost a tooth. The drawer stood silent, hands twitching. At midnight, he yanked his own molar and tossed it into the basin. The townsfolk cheered. But the drawer never returned. The feast continued. They say if you climb the cliffside and shout at the wind during winter, you'll hear it rattle. Not like leaves or thunder, but like teeth in a brass bowl. There was once a village where no one spoke above a whisper. Not the children, not the elders, not the crows who nested in the steeple. It wasn't fear that made them quiet. It was history. Decades ago, Before the roads turned to gravel and the river dried to trickle, a drawer named Haskell came to the village of Mern. He was clever, charming, and full of ideas. He promised comfort. He promised silence. He promised a way to end the pain without steel. He called it the hollowing. Haskell didn't pull teeth. He dulled them, filed them to stumps, drilled holes into the roots and packed them with crushed herbs. He burned the nerves with oil and ash. His patients screamed, but only once. Afterward, they couldn't scream again. At first, it was a miracle. No one lost teeth. No one bled. But then, people stopped laughing, stopped yelling. Children stopped crying. Elders stopped singing. One by one, their voices frayed like old rope. Some could hum. Others could barely breathe through their words. Haskell claimed it was a price for peace. He stayed for 5 years. Then he vanished, left his tools behind, a case of hollow needles and ash-soaked cloth. The villagers buried the case, planted a willow above it, but the silence remained. Even today, travelers note how the air feels thin in Mern, how conversations trail off, how no one interrupts. The village never rebuilt its bell tower, because what use is a bell if no one dares to make noise? High in the pine-covered cliffs of Scar Hollow, there was a monastery with no name, no bells, and no entry for the uninvited. The brothers who lived there spoke little, wrote less, and spent their waking hours tending the forest paths and boiling herbs in silence. Yet deep beneath their stone chapel, hidden in a room sealed with lime mortar and prayer, sat what they never spoke of, the room of teeth. A vault carved from bedrock, lit by shafts of filtered sun and scented by age. The floor was tiled with jawbones. The walls stacked with crates labeled not with words, but with dates and faces. And in the center, atop a stone pedestal, sat a chest, iron, bound and bolted shut. Within it, the records say, lay the molars of saints, sinners, kings, beggars, and beasts alike. Teeth extracted by monks over centuries, each with a story scrawled in fading ink on cloth scraps. Some were wrapped in ash, others in dried rose petals, a few in wax-sealed pouches too delicate to be opened. The monks believed that the soul resided not just in the heart or the head, but in the mouth. That the teeth held memories of speech, of confession, of pain endured in silence. They called it the voice of bone. One monk, Brother Eric, was appointed as guardian of the vault. He rarely joined the others in prayer. He slept beside the chest. Every night, he whispered to it. Not prayers, but questions. Once a new initiate asked to see the vault. Elric refused. The boy pressed. Elric relented. They descended together. But only Elric returned. The boy's name was struck from the monastery rolls. His chamber turned to storage, and above his bed, the monks painted a single white tooth. Over time, the vault's presence affected the monastery. The brothers began losing teeth at odd times, while eating, while sleeping, while speaking. One even found a tooth in his boot. None remembered pain. None remembered extraction. But they all remembered what followed: dreams of chewing stone and speaking fire. Eventually, the abbey sent word to the high clergy. The vault was sealed. The forest around it was blessed. And the monastery burned in a lightning storm 2 winters later. All that remains are ruins, and the whispers, low and toothy, from beneath the pine roots. In the bustling river town of Carfane, laughter spilled out from the taverns like owl on a crowded bench. Markets buzzed. Music twirled through alleyways, and once each summer, the carnival of gums and grin arrived. It wasn't a fair for children, nor was it ever advertised. It appeared overnight, colourful tents, wooden stages, velvet-covered carts, and disappeared just as quickly. The main event wasn't a puppet show. It wasn't a sword swallower or fire dancer. It was the draw's challenge. A painted booth, crimson and gold, stood at the carnival's heart. Inside sat the drawer, always masked, always robed in green. Never the same twice, yet always known. A sign hung above the booth, lose a tooth, gain a secret. The rules were simple. You sat. The drawer chose the tooth. If you endured without screaming, you were told a secret, a real one, about your future. About a lover's lie, about the night your grandfather wept. No one knew how the drawer knew. No one questioned it. Each year hundreds lined up, and every year more returned, to lose another tooth, to learn another truth, but some couldn't stop. A nobleman lost 10 teeth, a midwife 12. One sailor left grinning with no teeth at all, and claimed he had finally heard the silence between lies. The drawer never bled, never missed. The pain was real but precise, and the secrets always true. One girl bit down so hard on the drawer's glove that he whispered not a secret, but a warning. Some teeth protect you from truths you do not want. She fled. Days later, her house collapsed in a storm. She had told her family not to sleep upstairs. When the carnival vanished, it left behind no trash, no scent, no footprints, only teeth, scattered like white stones across the square. And every tooth, smiling. His name was Ferren, not famous, not feared. Just a drawer from the port town of Delwyth. He had no strange tools, no legends. He pulled teeth cleanly, said little, charged fairly. He kept no trophies. And yet, every village from the cliffs to the fields sent their worst cases to him. Ferren never married, never travelled. He kept his stall near the docks, between a candle maker and a man who carved whistles from bone. Each morning, he placed his tools on a clean cloth. Each night, he washed them with boiling water and dried them with linen that smelled faintly of lavender. He called pain a passage and silence its toll. He pulled for 30 years. Until one morning, he found a letter on his stool. It wasn't signed. It had no seal. It read, "You have taken 3/128 teeth. The last must be your own." A Ferren laughed, threw it away. But that night, he dreamed of every tooth he'd pulled, suspended in the air around him whispering. When he woke, he was bleeding from the mouth, his molars loosened. One by one, he pulled them himself. No pain, no blood, just emptiness. In 3 days, he had no teeth left. On the 4th, he vanished. His tools were found arranged in the shape of a smile. And beneath his stool, written in chalk, "Even silence has a cost." There was a town on the edge of the eastern marshes called Elwenmere. Windless, colourless, always wet. The kind of place where boots sank and spirits sank deeper. But it had one claim to fame: the archivist. She lived in the bell tower, not to ring it. The bell had long since cracked and fallen, but because it was high and dry, and the only room large enough for her collection. Her name was Merit. Nobody knew where she came from, but drawers from across the realm sent her teeth, each labelled, dated, sealed. Some came in velvet pouches, others wrapped in string and prayer. She catalogued each with ink and care. More than 5,000. She knew everyone. The tooth of a lord who murdered his brother. The canine of a child who survived plague. The rotted molar of a healer who never healed herself. She believed pain left residue, that the energy of suffering lingered in enamel. She called it the achievement. When drawers visited, she gave nothing freely. Only if they brought her something, rare teeth, unusual cases, would she show them her records. Some claimed to hear the teeth hum when touched. Others wept without knowing why. Her journals were bound in skin, her quills carved from wishbones. She wore no shoes and never opened her shutters. One drawer brought her a tooth removed from a corpse that had not blurred. Merritt studied it for days, then vanished for weeks. When she returned, she had written only one sentence. This tooth belonged to someone who died twice, and no one asked what that meant. When she died, no one touched her tower. It became a ruin. The teeth still there, lining the walls like pale constellations. Some say on windless nights, the tower rings, not from a bell, but from thousands of tiny mouths grinding. In the capital, where everything glittered, gowns, goblets, smiles, there was a drawer whose tools were made of glass. He wasn't born there. He came from the desert beyond the salt hills, where sand whispered like fire and breath dried in the mouth. There, his people made glass from lightning and dust, and he brought that art to pain. His name was Cillian. He set up his practice in a narrow street of perfumers and mirror sellers. No blood marked his cloths, no rust on his tools, just gleaming edges, crystalline handles, and light that refracted sorrow. He believed pain should be witnessed clearly. People feared him at first, said the tools would shatter, that they would slice flesh instead of pull it. But they didn't. They moved like silk, cold, precise. When they caught a tooth, the tooth surrendered. Cillian worked in silence, but his walls were mirrored. Patients watched themselves as he operated, watched every tremble, every drop of sweat, every tear. "Pain is honest," he once said, "and truth should be seen." The aristocracy adored him. They paid handsomely to suffer in beauty. Dressed in brocade, faces powdered, they lined his waiting room as if entering a salon. But it wasn't vanity that made Cillian famous. It was a boy, the son of a duchess, born with a jaw fused shut. No drawer dared attempt it. Cillian did. He created a blade of frost glass, thinner than breath. The operation took 3 hours. When it ended, the boy spoke his first word, "Water." The duchess wept. The city named Cillian, the gentle breaker, but fame weighs heavy. One night, his shop burned. The tools melted into puddles of colored flame. The mirrors cracked and sang. Cillian was never found, but in the ashes, one tooth remained, encased in crystal, smiling. In a village where the trees grew sideways and the wind sang low, there lived a drawer who never pulled a single tooth. His name was Noel. He had the tools. He had the skill. He had the patience. But when they sat in his chair, he did something strange. He listened. He listened to the pain. Not just its location, but its memory. He asked questions no drawer asked. What did you eat when it first hurt? Who were you with? What dream did you have the night before the H began? Then he gave you tea. Told you to come back in a week. Some came back cured. Others still in pain, but softened, not ready to let go. For Noel believed that pulling a tooth too soon robbed it of its story. And some stories, he said, needed time to tell themselves. The town mocked him, called him the hesitant hook, said he feared blood. But then the plague came, and Noel, who never touched a tooth, saved more people than all drawers combined. He boiled herbs, burned linens, isolated fevered homes, and when death passed by the village, it skipped his door. Afterward, people came not for extractions, but for advice, and Noel gave it. Pain, he said, is a message, not always a punishment. When he died, his tools were untouched, still sharp, still clean, and in his journal, one final line. I came to pull teeth. I stayed to pull stories. In a crypt beneath the ruined castle of Greymoor, sealed behind iron bars and a wall of forgotten curses, there lies a skull. Just one. Yellowed, cracked, but with all 32 teeth. Every last one. The tale says the man to whom it belonged, Sir Keldron, was cursed, not by witches but by choices. He betrayed his king, broke a holy oath, killed a healer who refused to follow orders. And in return, was given a gift, a mouth that could not close, that could not decay, that could not be silenced. They tried everything. Poured hot oil down his throat, sewed his lips shut, removed his tongue, pulled 10 teeth. The next morning the teeth returned. They grew back, stronger, whiter, hungrier. Some say Keldron begged to be beheaded. Others say he wandered the woods biting birds from the sky. But all agree. When he was finally caught, it took 3 men to hold him down, while the 4th drove a stake through his palate. They buried him. But the next week, the grave burst open. Only the skull remained. They locked it in a crypt, thinking it safe. But sometimes, just before storms, guards swear they hear chewing. Not loud, not angry, just steady. As if the skull remembers every word it never got to say. And still tries to say it. Her name was Elsha. Not of noble birth. Not tied to a school or a church. Just a woman who knew what pain sounded like, and decided to silence it. She called herself the last draw. By the time she set up her little red tent at the edge of Galsmore, pain was already on the run. The age of clumsy pliers and blood-soaked cloths had begun to end. People had heard of a miracle, an invisible trick from faraway lands, a way to make pain sleep. Anesthesia. It was a whisper at first, then a promise, then a bottle. Elsha never wore robes. Her sleeves were rolled. Her tent smelled not of rust and sweat, but lavender and clove. Her tools gleamed not because they were new, but because she cared for them like children. And her voice, calm, low, kind, was the first thing her patients remembered, and the last thing they heard before the numbness set in. Her patients didn't scream. They didn't clench their fists. Some even laughed, surprised that something so feared could be so simple. She carried a wooden box filled with vials. Either chloroform, opium when needed. A gift, she said, from a French doctor who had once feared draws more than death. I'll never let another feel what I felt, he told her. And so, Elsha pulled teeth in silence. Not the kind born of trauma, but of peace. The town changed. Children didn't grow up terrified of their mouths. Old men stopped hiding their jaws. Women smiled without shame. Elsha's red tent became a legend. Not because of pain, but because of its absence. And one day, when she was old, she packed up her tools, kissed the cloth that covered her box, and left a single note. Let pain sleep now. Let mercy speak instead. In the heart of the city stood a building of white stone and warm windows. Inside, there was a chair. It reclined. It hummed. It did not hurt. The drawer, now called a dentist, wore gloves, mances. Their tools were small, silent, sterile. Children sat in the chair and were told stories. Elders sat and listened to music. A light swung overhead. Not fire, but clean. Bright illumination that made the room feel safe. When teeth were pulled, there was no cracking of bone or howling in markets. Just a small sigh, a soft "you're done." No more being held down. No more clamping jaws or heated iron. No more feasts of broken bread. Now there was gauze, cool gel, an ice pack and a gentle smile. When the numbness wore off, the pain was manageable. When infection came, it was met with pills, tiny, powerful grains of progress that killed what once killed entire villages. The teeth were no longer reminders of agony. They were polished, protected, clean. Some still feared the chair, but most didn't. Because the world had changed. Because people remembered. Because we had learned. And if you've ever sat in one of those chairs, fingers tapping your thighs, music in your ears, a kind voice saying, "You'll be okay," then you've already lived a kind of miracle. A gift from every scream that came before you. You brush, you rinse, you smile, You touch your jaw and feel nothing but smooth skin. You see your reflection, and it is not afraid. You eat what you like, sleep through the night, speak without hesitation. You schedule a visit, not out of fear, but out of care. You sit in a waiting room. You read a magazine. And when the dentist calls your name, you walk toward the chair. No one's screaming. No one's praying. No one's tying you down. The tray beside you gleams with polished steel. It doesn't smell like rust or rot. The air smells like peppermint. The lights do not flicker. The drawers do not shake. And somewhere in that moment, between numbness and relief, you forget what came before. But you shouldn't. Because what you feel now, the comfort, the trust, the ease, it was paid for. Paid in blood and screams. In burned fingers. In whispered prayers and broken jaws. The past bled so the present could breathe. So the next time you smile, remember those who never could, and give thanks. This is where the story ends. Not with a scream. Not with blood. But with a deep breath in a quiet room. We began in markets, in alleyways, in stalls dripping with agony. We walked through plague and prayer, through broken hearts and shattered jaws. We met drawers who healed, and ones who harmed. We heard bones whisper and masks lie. And now, we sit in light. We hear laughter in waiting rooms. We forget that once, to lose a tooth was to lose a part of your soul. Medicine advanced. And so did mercy. So if you're watching this, if you've ever sat in that chair, or feared it, or thanked it, know this, you live in a time of peace. Not perfect, not painless, but better. And for that, be grateful. Because it once sucked to be a medieval dentist. And it sucked even more to be their patient. But you're safe now. So rest your jaw. Smile wide. And remember, the worst pain passed long ago. Hidden deep beneath a crumbling abbey in the north, beyond the overgrown gardens and broken steeple, lies a library unlike any other. There are no books, no scrolls, no candlelit tomes, only drawers, thousands of them, each marked by a name long forgotten, each holding a mouth, preserved in wax, framed in copper, sealed in silence, mouths from every age of agony. A knight's jaw shattered at siege, a child's crooked teeth, pulled too soon, a mother's molars dark with disease, a priest's mouth locked mid-prayer, all encased in rows like a macabre alphabet of pain. They called it the archive of suffering, built not to celebrate pain, but to remember it, to ensure it would never return. At its center stood a circle of stone benches, and in the middle, an empty chair. Visitors came rarely. Only doctors, historians, healers brave enough to sit, to look, to listen. For when you sat in the chair, the mouth spoke, not with words, but memory. Cold, quiet flashes of lives lived through clenched teeth and muffled cries. And when you rose, the pain wasn't yours. But the gratitude was. There was once a girl named Kyle, born in the new world, where pain had become a memory. Her teeth were straight, her gums pink, her laugh effortless. She had never heard the word, draw. She had never known what it meant to fear her own mouth. But Kale had curiosity, and one day, while visiting her grandfather, she found a box in his attic. Inside, a tooth dark as coal, wrapped in old silk, and a note. "This is what love looked like before the world got kind," she asked. He told her, slowly, carefully, about screams in alleyways, about cloth soaked in wine, about the silence after a child's jaw shattered. Kyle didn't cry. She listened. Years later, she became a dentist. Not because she loved teeth, but because she loved what they no longer meant. Her chair was warm, her gloves gentle, her tools quiet, and every patient, before they left, received a small card. "You live in a time where your smile no longer hurts. Please use it often." The word, draw, has faded now. Most don't know it. Fewer still say it. It belongs to dust and parchment, to superstition and memory. We don't need drawers anymore. We have dentists. We have light. We have music and mirrors and mint. But in some corners of the world, the legacy lingers. In villages where power flickers. In homes where fear still echoes. There, people remember. They whisper about pain that walked in daylight, about blood that sang louder than hymns. And even here, where numbness waits in bottles and precision hums from machines. We should remember too, because forgetting makes it easier to go back. And there is no going back. If you place your fingers to your jaw and press gently, you feel nothing but pulse. No ache, no fire, no scream tucked behind your molars. But centuries ago, every village had a silence that lasted longer than night. The silence after a tooth was pulled, when the blood had slowed, when the pain had drained, when the sobbing had stopped, but the memory had not. They sat alone, in corners, behind doors, holding ice if they had it, clenching rags between teeth, waiting for something they couldn't name to leave them. That was the longest silence. And it stretched across years, across continents, across mouths that never knew relief. Until mercy came, until science listened, until someone said, enough. And now, that silence was gone. Pain was once normal, expected, accepted. But then came a moment, not recorded in any great book, where someone, somewhere, stood in a dark room with pliers in hand, and said, there must be a better way. And that was the line. The one we crossed and never returned from. We didn't lose pain all at once. It faded, slowly, with every clean tool, every gentle voice, every pill, every promise kept. And now, your child will never know what it means to scream into a rag. Your friend will never faint from a molar's rot. Your smile will never carry the shadow of survival. Because we crossed the line. And we brought you with us. He was not a dentist. Not anymore. He hadn't pulled a tooth in 30 years. His clinic was long closed, his tools given away. He walked slower now, smiled less. But his mind, sharp as ever, they called him Eli. Children waved when he passed. Elders nodded in quiet respect. They didn't know what he had seen, because Eli remembered, not from books, not from stories, from life. He had been the last apprentice of a drawer. He'd held the jaw of a crying widow, while her rotten molars snapped like twigs. He'd boiled iron pliers in river water. He'd watched infection climb a child's throat like ivy. He had smelled death behind the gums. Then came the change. Eli was there the day anesthetic arrived in a glass vial, clutched in a shaking hand. He was the first in his village to numb pain. The first to pull without a scream. The first to sit afterward in the dark and cry, not from guilt, but from relief. He lived through the shift, from agony to quiet, from butchery to care, and now, he taught no students. He built no statues. But every year, on the anniversary of his first painless pull, he sat in a park bench and placed a tooth, wrapped in cloth, beneath a tree. "Let it rot here?" he whispered. Not in a mouth. And he smiled, not for himself, but for the world that had learned. In the National Museum of Medicine, behind glass thicker than a book's spine, lies a tooth. Dark, chipped, cracked straight down the root. Beside it, a placard reads, "This molar was pulled in the 13th century by a drawer known only as the Crow." It was found beside a bundle of rosemary and a blood-stained ribbon. Thousands pass it every month. Some stare, some wince, a few scoff. But one day, a child, 9, curious, missing 2 teeth of her own, stood at the glass a long time. She turned to her father. "Why did they keep it?" He paused, then answered, "Because we used to scream." That night, the girl brushed her teeth without complaint. and her dreams were quiet. It's easy to forget what a mouth holds. Not just words, not just food, but memory of song, of silence, of clenching through grief, of biting back words, of speaking love, of praying through pain. And once, of surviving agony no child should know. Now, the world hums with ease. Pain is a problem to be solved, not endured. But in the quietest corners, when the light flickers low and your tongue brushes a molar, something ancient stirs. The echo of those who bit cloth instead of breathing, who whispered through broken lips so their children wouldn't hear, who survived not just because they were strong, but because they had no choice. And you are their miracle. Once a year, in a village with no name, people gather in silence, no candles, no feasts, no prayers, just silence. They bring a single white cloth, fold it, place it on a table, and leave. No one explains it, no one interrupts. It's not about religion or ritual. It's about absence, about honoring a world where pain used to rule the mouth, and no longer does. The cloth represents nothing. No tools, no teeth, no blood. Just quiet. And in that quiet lives the loudest gratitude of all. A grandfather was brushing his teeth beside his granddaughter when she paused and looked up. "Did it always feel like this?" she asked. "No," he said, rinsing. "It used to feel like fire." She frowned. "Why didn't they stop it?" He smiled sadly. "They didn't know how." "But we do," she said. "Yes," he whispered. "We do now." As she finished brushing, spit wiped her chin. "Then we should never forget," she said. And somehow, in that moment, she became the keeper of everything that came before. Not because she knew it, but because she asked. This story began in blood, in darkness, in screams and prayers and pliers and masks that didn't work. But look where it ends. It ends with clean fingers and peppermint breath. It ends with lullabies and nightlights. It ends with chairs that hum and hands that help. It ends with smiles. Not perfect ones, not always white, not always straight, but painless. And that, after everything, means everything. So smile. Not because you have to, but because you can. Now the blade has dulled, the tools are quiet, and the room is empty. But the stories. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. In a world that once moved without mercy, you've walked beside it, quietly, thoughtfully. Until then, stay well and sleep easy.